Hello.
Right.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this Earth Week event. If you haven't seen the rest of our schedule, check out the Bellevue College Earth Week schedule at bellevuecollege.edu/sustainability. We have lots of events this week for you to participate in. So some etiquette before we get going on our presentation. If you have any technical problems or if you just have general Q&A, please use the chat box located on the right. You'll see a live event Q&A. So what will happen with the Q&A is it will be reviewed and then it will be posted. So you might not see it in live time. As well, we are on a few second delay, so expect that as well. As for other etiquette, this will be a recorded event, as I mentioned, so please do be polite. All attendees are muted and cameras are disabled. So like I said, use the Q&A box if you'd like to get our attention or talk or make a question. And then lastly, we do have a survey that we would like you to complete for this event to let us know how we did and also to help us put on events like this in the future. That survey will be posted in the live event Q&A box as well. So to kick this off, my name's Amber. I'm the Sustainability Director at Bellevue College, and I helped to coordinate this event with our team. And today we are joined by Dr. Brian Casserly. So Brian has taught at Bellevue College since 2009 and has been a full-time faculty member since 2012. Before joining BC as a full-time instructor, he also taught at the University of Washington and at North Seattle, Highline, Shoreline, and Everett Community Colleges. Casserly teaches U.S. history, Pacific Northwest history, U.S. military history, and the history of World War II. He's developing a class on the environmental history of the U.S., which he hopes to teach in the next year or two. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Casserly to our event today. Hi, Brian.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. I wanted to thank everybody at the Office of Sustainability for inviting me to give this talk today. Just bear with me a moment while I share my slides with you. Can you see that title slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So let me go ahead and get started. So I'm going to be focusing on the growth of the U.S. environmental movement for the next 45 minutes or so. And I want to talk a little bit about why the environmental movement develops and what are some of the factors that are going to be driving the development of an environmental movement in the United States, particularly by the end of the 20th century. So the major question we have today that we're trying to address and try to find some answers to are, why did the environmental movement develop? And there are two major points that I would make to summarize why it developed, and we'll be going into these in a little bit more detail as we progress through the talk this afternoon. One of those issues is that in the second half of the 20th century, concerns are going to develop amongst many Americans about environmental degradation and about threats to the environment from a variety of different sources. And we'll be talking about some of those in the next few minutes. The other thing that is helping to shape the emergence of the environmental movement in the period after World War II is that there is a sense of optimism in American society about possibilities for social change in the 1960s and 1970s. The environmental movement does not emerge in a vacuum. It's taking place in a broader social and cultural context in the United States, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, in which people are thinking about how can they make American society better? How can they make American society work more equitably for all Americans? And it's from that context that the environmental movement is going to emerge. So it's emerging in the context in which you also have movements that some of you are probably already familiar with, such as the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the gay rights movement, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so there's a lot of cross-fertilization going on between these social movements and the environmental movement in the 1960s and 1970s that helps to give rise to environmentalism in the United States. But let's go back a long way before the 1960s, and let's think about the dominant attitude of Americans towards the environment for much of U.S. history. And you can still see this attitude towards the environment among some Americans, even today in 2020. And that idea of the environment, or that attitude towards the environment, is dominated by an attitude that basically sees the environment as a source of profit. Natural resources like timber, minerals, fish, etc., are there to be basically exploited by human beings with the goal of benefiting economically from those resources. And we see, beginning in the 1800s, the commodification of natural resources. This is an image from Washington State, marketing Columbia River salmon at the very end of the 1800s. So salmon, lumber, all other kinds of natural resources like that are seen purely in terms of profit. There's very little concern about the long-term sustainability of resources like salmon or lumber or other resources. The same thing pretty much applies to the whole idea of pollution. This is a photograph of a steel plant, a steel manufacturing plant at Homestead, Pennsylvania, sometime in the late 1800s. And Homestead, Pennsylvania was one of the major centers of the steel industry in the United States in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century. And when industry operated in the 1800s and until well down into the 20th century, it did so without much concern about things like water pollution or air pollution. Polluting the water, polluting the air was just seen as an acceptable cost of doing business in the United States by pretty much everybody. There were a few voices in opposition to this, but those voices were few and far between. So those are some of the basic attitudes towards the environment that would have existed in the United States until well after World War II. And we'll be talking more about what happens after World War II pretty much for the rest of the talk today. And if you have questions, you can use the chat function to address those questions. And I'll be stopping at a later point during the talk to give you the opportunity to give me the opportunity to address some of the questions that might have been raised by people. Okay, so let's think about what happens after World War II when we start to see the emergence of environmentalism or the environmental movement. And the context is that after World War II, the United States is going to be experiencing a period of extended economic prosperity. Most Americans are doing pretty well. They're enjoying a decent standard of living. And as part of that prosperity that will characterize the US after World War II, we're going to see the development of a massive movement of suburbanization. Millions of Americans are leaving overcrowded inner cities in the United States, and they are moving out to brand new suburbs that are being built on the outskirts of those cities. And this process of suburbanization is facilitated by the development of all kinds of new infrastructure. And I'm going to show you two examples specific to the greater Seattle area, but Seattle is not unique in this regard. The same thing is happening in other parts of the United States as well during the period after World War II. So, for example, as part of the infrastructure that is helping to facilitate suburbanization, the first bridge across Lake Washington was completed in 1940, and that bridge is going to open up the east side of Lake Washington to allow the development of suburban communities. It's easy to forget, but before the first bridge across Lake Washington was built, all of the towns on the east side of the lake were relatively small. Bellevue, Redmond, Issaquah, Kirkland, these were all pretty small, for the most part, farming or logging towns without very large populations. But the opening up of the bridge across the lake is going to mean that people can live in places like Bellevue, but commute to jobs in Seattle. And that idea of the infrastructure helping to promote suburbanization is going to be increased with the development of the freeway system in the United States, starting in the late 1950s. This is a photograph of the I-5 freeway under construction through Seattle in 1963. And again, this is going to facilitate the development of suburbanization. This is ultimately what most people moving out to the suburbs are looking for. A home in the suburbs away from the overcrowded neighborhoods of central cities like Seattle. And they want to have a larger home with a larger lot. And that's going to lead to the development of significant suburban communities like Bellevue, Washington, or Kirkland, or Issaquah, or numerous other suburban communities all across the United States. But central to these suburban developments that are taking place after World War II are ideas about what we could call quality of life. And quality of life is going to be something which is regarded as being very closely intertwined with nature, with the environment. If you look at this home, for example, you can see the trees in the background. And trees and a natural landscape are regarded as being valuable parts of these suburban communities that are developing all across the United States in the period after World War II. For many people who move to the Pacific Northwest and who want to live out in the suburbs, it's images like this that reflect the importance of the natural environment to life in the Pacific Northwest that are going to be very important. So in this image, for example, we can see encapsulated three of the major symbols of the environment and its importance to the Pacific Northwest: Mount Rainier, the forest, the orcas, and Puget Sound. That's actually 4 symbols, but I never could count, so let's not worry about it. And so this is again going to be replicated across the United States. Now, obviously, the rest of the country doesn't have Puget Sound or Mount Rainier or orcas, but they will have their own areas of natural beauty that are linked to this idea of moving out to the suburbs in the period after World War II. And part of this quality of life that people moving to the suburbs are hoping to enjoy are going to include a range of outdoor recreational opportunities that are closely linked to the environment. Things like, for example, hiking or kayaking or camping or fishing, snowboarding, skiing, whatever they might be. So quality of life concerns are going to become a major aspect of living in the suburbs in the aftermath of World War II, and they will be one of the driving forces behind people wanting to move out to the suburbs, in the belief that the suburbs offer people a higher standard of living, a better quality of life that is closely tied to a cleaner, more natural environment than people might be able to experience living in a more urban area. So moving on to examine some of the things that are going to help to influence the emergence of environmentalism. Many people who move out to the suburbs are going to become increasingly concerned by what they see as environmental degradation and threats to the environment that are emerging after World War II. One of those threats is involving a term that we have become used to in the Puget Sound area, but again, which is not unique to the Puget Sound area over the course of the last half a century or so, and that is the whole idea of sprawl. Sprawl becomes a term that people become concerned about as suburban communities grow after World War II. And a term that comes to be associated with this is fears of the development of what comes to be called megalopolis. Megalopolis involves a massive city that is expanding significantly beyond its original boundaries, swallowing up natural areas, areas of unique natural beauty, and also swallowing up the suburbs where people had moved to in a search for a life closer to nature and the recreational opportunities that the natural environment provided. The next image is an imagination from the late 1960s of what the greater Seattle area might actually look like by the end of the 20th century, unless there were action taken to stop this level of suburban sprawl. So this is from the Seattle Times in the 1960s, and it's reflecting a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, of what will come to be known as Pugetopolis, a massive city stretching from the Canadian border down to Oregon that will stretch westwards all the way across the Olympic Peninsula to the beaches of the Pacific Ocean. And you can see this massive built-up area as the artist is depicting it here. And that's something that is going to drive many people to become concerned about the environment, concerned about the damage being done by sprawl to the environment and to what they believe is their standard of living and their quality of life. And people will be mobilized to try to do something to stop this idea or this vision from becoming reality. by the end of the 20th century. Other people are going to be concerned about the loss of open space. People had moved to the suburbs because there was more space available particularly for recreation, but also space just to enjoy the aesthetic value of that open space, the views that people might have. And again, by the early 1960s, people are concerned about what they see as the loss of this open space. This is the cover of a magazine called the Saturday Evening Post, and it features a bulldozer clearing away natural space in order to facilitate suburban development. And the caption on the image is pretty startling: "The Rape of the Land." The subtitle reads, "As our cities spread out cancerously in all directions, we are destroying, for profit, too many of the green and open places we need to make life livable." Now think about the language being used in that caption. The rape of the land, the spreading out of cities cancerously, destroying too many of the green and open places we need to make life livable. So that's part of this idea of the increasing concerns about the environment in this period that people are beginning to express that will ultimately help to give rise to an environmental movement by the end of the 1960s. Other people are worried about the destruction of natural areas that are more remote, that are being destroyed to build things like, for example, hydroelectric dams of various kinds across the United States. So across the US, people are becoming more concerned about development more widely that is affecting people in the United States, and as they see it, acting in a detrimental way towards the environment. People have other things to be worried about with regard to the environment in the 1950s and 1960s as well. So, for example, up until the 1960s, nuclear fallout was a major issue in American society. The United States, the Soviet Union, and other nations which had nuclear weapons tested those nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, just like you can see here in Nevada in the 1950s. So they're literally blowing up nuclear warheads to make sure that those warheads work as they were designed to do. The explosion of those warheads as part of these tests releases massive quantities of radioactive nuclear fallout into the atmosphere, and that helps to spur concern amongst many people in the United States about the health consequences, the damage being done to human health by exposure to radioactive nuclear fallout created by these nuclear tests by the United States and other nations at this point. Other people are becoming concerned in the 1960s by a whole range of other sources of pollution that are starting to create major concerns amongst many people in the United States. The production of a wide variety of household chemicals, cleaning supplies, fertilizers for people's yards, weed killers, all those kinds of things are creating massive levels of pollution that are having negative consequences for the health and of both human beings and the health of the wider environment in the United States. And that's something that people are becoming concerned about in the 1960s as well. Now, one of the turning points in terms of awareness amongst the general American public about pollution comes in the early 1960s and the publication of a book by a woman called Rachel Carson. The book's title was Silent Spring. And Silent Spring was a book in which Rachel Carson, who was a trained biologist, basically explores the damage being done to the natural environment by a wide range of chemicals that were being widely used in American society by the early part of the 1960s. And Carson in particular was concerned about the damage being done to bird populations in the United States. And I want to read you a brief quote from Silent Spring for just a few moments. So Rachel Carson wrote in this book, quote, "There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. And that's where she got the title of her book from, this idea of silent spring. That springtime in the United States, a time which should be marked by the sound of birdsong, that springtime was becoming increasingly quiet because bird populations were declining as birds were being killed as a result of exposure to widespread chemical pollution across the United States. And Rachel Carson's book will provide a wake-up call to millions of Americans in the early 1960s about the negative consequences of a wide variety of commonly used chemicals that previously people had used without thinking about them all that extensively. Now people are starting to become more aware that there is an environmental cost to those chemicals, and people are starting to demand government regulation of various kinds of chemicals in order to ensure that the environment is going to be protected as much as possible. We can see concerns about pollution more closely in our own neighborhood, also emerging in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s, for example, as a result of suburban growth all around Lake Washington in places like Bellevue, Kirkland, Woodinville, Bothell, Renton, Issaquah, Redmond, etc., those new suburban communities dealt with the sewage produced by those suburban communities and dealt with the wastewater that those communities produced by essentially flushing it into Lake Washington. And by the end of the 1950s, Lake Washington was incredibly polluted. And the lake was regularly shut down to swimming by people because of the threat that it posed to human health. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, people in the area around Lake Washington are going to come together and will organize to try to clean up the lake. They will establish a brand new agency in the greater Seattle area called Metro. We know today, Metro today as being the agency that runs public transit in the greater Seattle area. But Metro is also still involved in dealing with sewage treatment and with wastewater treatment. And that was actually its original function when it was established in the 1960s. And it's established in response to these concerns about threats to the environment of Lake Washington that had become dire by the end of the 1950s. As a result of Metro's actions and other environmental cleanup that has targeted Lake Washington in the decades since the end of the 1950s, Lake Washington today is a relatively clean body of water where you can swim, boat, catch fish in, etc., safely without having to worry about threats to your health. And that's in large part a consequence of the rise of environmental concerns in the 1950s and 1960s. Other examples of human pollution that was causing major problems in various other places across the United States that raise awareness of pollution and that help to motivate people to become more concerned about the environment include what happened to the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, on a regular basis in the 1950s and 1960s. Cleveland was a heavily industrial city, and many industrial wastes were pumped into the Cuyahoga River in the 1950s and 1960s. And those wastes were so bad and so toxic that on a number of occasions in the 1950s and 1960s, the Cuyahoga River spontaneously caught fire. Now imagine that for a moment. The idea of a river catching fire. Water, which is what a river is supposed to be comprised of, is not supposed to go on fire. But the Cuyahoga River was so polluted with toxic chemicals that by the 1950s and 1960s, it wasn't unusual for the river to spontaneously combust. And eventually this raises environmental consciousness and leads to efforts to try to clean up the environment and regulate industry so that these kinds of chemicals are not flushed into the river in the way that they had been up until the 1960s. Other examples of pollution that will encourage environmental consciousness include a major oil spill that will occur off the coast of Southern California in early 1969. This occurred particularly off the coast around the area of Santa Barbara. Now, Santa Barbara is a wealthy community, and that the wealthy beachfront property owners who owned property along the beach by Santa Barbara were outraged by the damage being done to the environment, literally in their backyard, by this oil spill in early 1969. And these people would be politically connected enough to organize themselves and put pressure on the government of California and on the United States government to try to bring about new regulations about drilling for oil off the coast of California. Other things that are going to help to give rise to environmental consciousness include things that we don't necessarily think about with regards to the environmental movement right off the bat. And one of them is a growing general awareness of the overall fragility of life on planet Earth. And that awareness is particularly emphasized as a result of the space program and the effort to put the first human beings on the moon by the end of the 1960s. As those astronauts fly to the moon, they take some of the first extensive photographs of planet Earth. And what these photographs help to do is to emphasize to many people back on Earth just how fragile our home planet Earth actually was. They also bring home to people back on Earth that we really only have one home. Despite what science fiction movies might tell us, we don't have any place else to go to. So we better take good care of planet Earth to make sure that it continues to be a good home to all human beings on the planet. And that will also influence that idea of the Earth being fragile and the only home planet available to us, brought or reinforced for us by the photographs from space. That's also going to raise consciousness about the environment in the 1960s. Popular culture of the 1960s will also bring home to many Americans the need for greater concern about the environment and the need to do something to protect the environment. And there will be a variety of artists, music artists in particular, who will emphasize the need for greater environmental consciousness and the need for environmental protection during this period. One of my favorite artists during this period, and one of my favorite songs that reflect an environmental theme during this period, is the artist, singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell, who releases a song called Big Yellow Taxi in 1970. And you can see the lyrics of the song here on the screen. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. That's reflecting some of the concerns that we've seen earlier in this talk about the loss of open space. She goes on to say down at the last chorus, "Hey, farmer, farmer, put away that DDT now." DDT was a very toxic chemical that was widely used to fight against pests of various kinds. It was also used for mosquito control across the United States. And it was a chemical that was toxic to both human beings and many other parts of the American environment, and indeed the global environment. One of the parts of the environment that would be particularly impacted by DDT included birds. And so that brings us back to a connection with Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring book that had been written at the early part of the 1960s. DDT, incidentally, would also be a major contributor towards the declining population of the American bald eagle. Now think about that for a second. The bald eagle is the symbol of the United States. But by the end of the 1960s, bald eagles were on the verge of extinction in the United States because of their exposure to widespread chemical pollution, including DDT. So we've looked at concerns about environmental degradation and threats, and we've also seen the emergence of optimism about possibilities for social change in the 1960s and 1970s. During those 2 decades, particularly the 1960s, we see a range of social movements becoming influential in American society. The civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And these movements, all of them, were predicated on a willingness to question government and large corporations, to demand changes in American society. And that's what the environmental movement, as it emerges by the end of the 1960s, is also going to be emphasizing. The environmental movement is going to experience a significant degree of cross-fertilization from some of these other social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. It's not at all unusual for somebody who is becoming involved in the environmental movement at this time to have already gotten experience in the civil rights movement or the women's liberation movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement. And they're going to take that experience from other social movements and apply it to the environmental movement at the end of the 1960s. This is going to lead to efforts to tackle environmental problems and to change mindsets about the environment more widely in American society and culture during this period. And those ideas about the environment are going to ultimately lead to the emergence of this new social movement, environmentalism. And by the end of the 1960s, environmentalism had started to coalesce into a distinctive social movement of its own. That's not to say that environmental concerns and environmental activists hadn't been around before the end of the 1960s, but by the end of the 60s, environmentalism is now its own distinct social movement in American society. And that's rise of environmentalism as a social movement is going to be epitomized by the emergence of Earth Day by early 1970. The New York Times wrote about this in late 1969 when it wrote, quote, "Rising concern about the environmental crisis is sweeping the nation's campuses with an intensity that may be on its way to eclipsing student discontent over the war in Vietnam." So students who had earlier been concerned about the war in Vietnam are now also starting to become concerned about the environment. And the New York Times article goes on to describe how, quote, "a national day of observance of environmental problems is being planned." Let me pause there for a few moments and ask if there are any questions that I can deal with for the next couple of minutes.
We do have one question already that came through from Kathy H. Kathy H says, "I think that in England, a romantic view of nature merged after or alongside the Industrial Revolution. Was there a similar attitude in the US before the 1950s, or was the country so vast that nature was viewed as more exploitable, more as something to be conquered?"
That is an excellent question. Yes, there was a romantic idea about nature that developed in the United States during the early 1800s. But the second part of Kathy's point is very important. For many Americans, in fact, for most Americans, the belief was that resources were just so inexhaustible in the United States that it would never be possible to ultimately use up all of those resources. Now, by the end of the 1800s, there will be some efforts to protect the environment, but by and large, this idea about continuing to exploit the environment for profit was the dominant attitude in the United States. There will be some efforts to protect areas of natural beauty. Places like, for example, Yellowstone National Park will be established as a national park. Mount Rainier National Park will become a national park by the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 20th century. But by and large, the dominant idea continued to be that the environment was there to be used for profit, to be economically exploited for the benefit of the people of the United States. So I hope that addresses the question. And I'm happy to entertain other questions that anybody might have about other aspects of what I've been talking about. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to move on. Is that okay? Or is there any other questions coming in?
I do not see any other questions at the moment.
Great, so let me move on, but if there is any other questions, be sure to use the chat function, and I'll be happy to try to address those before we finish up today. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes left before we wrap things up. So let's continue on. So this New York Times article from 1969 is highlighting the idea that there's going to be some sort of a national day of observation. That's what eventually is going to become Earth Day. And the first Earth Day will be celebrated just a few months later on April 22nd in 1970. And this is the front page of the New York Times on the day after, on April 23rd. And the headline basically says it all. Millions join Earth Day observances across the nation. And this is a picture which isn't all that clear, but it depicts the tens of thousands of people in New York who will throng to Fifth Avenue in New York City, in Manhattan, to celebrate Earth Day. Fifth Avenue, which would usually be thronged with traffic, is instead going to be packed with people who are expressing their concerns about the environment as part of this Earth Day celebration. And you can see some of the subheadings down here. The mood is joyful as the city gives its support to Earth Day. So there's a sense of optimism about this new social movement and about the ability of people in the United States to use public pressure to force governments to take action, to regulate industry, to protect the environment, and to limit pollution and other sources of threats to the environment at this time. Let me show you a number of other images from Earth Day across the United States. This is a similar gathering in front of the Independence Mall in Philadelphia, again on April 22nd, 1970. And there would be Earth Day celebrations also in Seattle on the University of Washington campus, and also at Seattle Central Community College in downtown Seattle up on Broadway. There would also be a celebration of Earth Day, and they would take things maybe a little bit further than some of the other Earth Day celebrations around the United States. Students at Seattle Central basically destroyed a car as a symbol of the damage done by automobiles to the environment in the United States. I'm pretty sure it was a trashed car anyway, so it's not like they're trashing a brand new car. But this is again an example of the criticism that many ordinary Americans are expressing about how the environment had been treated up to this point in time, and it reflects the galvanization of hundreds of thousands of Americans to become more concerned about the environment. Americans are going to take that concern and they're going to demand government action. And the US government, the federal government of the United States, had taken action in response to concerns expressed by the public going all the way back to the early part of the 1960s. In 1964, for example, the government had passed the Wilderness Act, which allows the government to set aside areas of the United States as wilderness areas where no economic activity or any sort of development can take place. The government had passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1968, a series of Clean Air and Water Acts in the 1960s and early 1970s to address questions of air and water pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency was established in 1970, and the Endangered Species Act was set up in 1973. And one of the first species protected by the Endangered Species Act in 1973 would be that symbol of the United States, the bald eagle. The bald eagle, which had been in danger of extinction by the end of the 1960s, will be listed as an endangered species and will benefit from all kinds of protections, including restrictions on the use of toxic chemicals that were having negative effects on bald eagle and other bird populations in the United States. And bald eagle populations in the United States are going to recover to the point that in 2020, there is a very healthy population of bald eagles in the United States, including right here in the greater Seattle area. I don't know about the rest of you who are watching this today, but regularly on my way home, I see a bald eagle perched in a tree. He's even gotten to the point that I pretty much say hello to him on my way home. And so that's an example of how the environmental movement has brought about significant change. So let's evaluate for a few moments whether the environmental movement was a success or not. And the result of the environmental movement is that to some extent it was a success. There was a new awareness amongst millions of Americans about the need for protection of the environment, a wide range of different forms of protection for the environment, and a new awareness of environmental problems more widely. There's also a new awareness of the need for local, state, and federal action by governments at all levels across the United States. Oregon, for example, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, became the poster child for state-level efforts to protect the environment. The governor of Oregon in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a man called Tom McCall, campaigned vigorously to introduce a bottle bill whereby all cans and bottles for beverages in Oregon would have to carry a deposit to encourage recycling. And that Oregon was the first state in the nation to do that. As we've already seen, the federal government passed a series of laws to protect the environment as well during this period. And I've already mentioned some of these, and many of these laws have been very successful in helping to protect significant parts of the environment in the United States. But, and there is a but with regard to evaluating the success of the environmental movement, the movement has had some problems in terms of successfully addressing a range of environmental issues. And obviously the big one that comes to mind is climate change. The environmental movement and those concerned about climate change have not yet been successful in forcing major action on the part of not just the government of the United States, but ordinary American citizens to take the threat of climate change seriously and to take serious action to address the threat of climate change. One of the related issues with regard to the kind of the mixed success of the environmental movement has been the failure of the environmental movement to engage a broad swath of the American population. The environmental movement as it emerged in the 1960s and 1970s tended to skew, not exclusively, but it tended to skew middle class and white. And it didn't always address the needs and the concerns of poorer Americans and Americans of color. And that would also be a long-term weakness of the movement that to some extent has limited its ability to appeal to a broad mass of the American population to deal with a wide range of problems facing the United States and indeed the world as a whole with regard to global environmental issues such as climate change. Let me stop there. I wanted to thank all of you for listening in and tuning in to this talk. And I also wanted to reiterate my thanks to the Office of Sustainability. They have some great programs on this week. I would urge you to check them out. They're available on their website, or you can also see them on the BC FYI notice that comes out to your Bellevue College email every day. So I would urge you to check those out. And I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and most of all, sane as we deal with this weird situation that we're in right now. I'll be happy to stay around and answer any questions for anybody who might have some for the next few minutes. Otherwise, thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all back on campus in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time today to present as a part of our Earth Week and helping us celebrate today the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is super exciting. I know I definitely learned a lot about the history of the environmental movement, especially in our area, not being from here. So that was a really great lesson for me to learn today.
Good, thank you.
We do have a question on the board. It is from an anonymous person. Was the environmentalism movement looked down upon or not taken seriously in comparison to the women's or Civil War movements?
Civil rights movement? That's a good question. I would say that the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement were probably larger movements that were maybe more successful in making their issues clearly relevant to many people in the United States. But certainly by the end of the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s, the environmental movement had also made significant progress in that regard. It's hard to really measure the relative success of these social movements. If we go back to, for example, the list of federal laws that were passed largely as a result of pressure from environmentalists in the 1960s and 1970s, these laws are not by any means a limited success. These are still significant laws that regulate many parts of the environment today. The Environmental Protection Agency still exists today. The Endangered Species Act still exists. There are still wilderness areas. So it's really hard to measure the relative success of the environmental movement when you put it up against others of the social movements that emerged or that were active during the 1960s and 1970s. So I don't have a really clear answer for that, because I don't think you can really say definitively one way or another that one movement was more successful or more relevant than the others.
Great, thank you. That actually leads into the next question from Seamus A. Seamus says, I think the fact that was used here is important. Do you feel that the movement lost steam throughout the following years, and if so, why?
Yes, there's no doubt that the environmental movement will lose some steam in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Part of it had to do with a sense of complacency on the part of the American public. So as these laws, for example, that I've been talking about, as those laws were enacted, they dealt with some of the most egregious environmental problems in the United States. So things like various species being on the verge of extinction. The most obvious species, like the bald eagles, for example, they were rebounding in population by the end of the 1970s into the 1980s. By the 1970s, Clean Air and Water Acts were certainly addressing things like pollution and helping to make it much more difficult for large industries to dump their pollution either in the atmosphere or in rivers and lakes and into the ocean. So the more egregious aspects of environmental damage were addressed by some of these reforms, and that certainly helped to make many Americans complacent about the environment. Politically, however, there was a movement in a more conservative political direction, particularly in the 1980s and onwards, and political conservatives were oftentimes skeptical about environmental protection and instead emphasized the need for business to be able to operate more freely, for business to be able to continue to exploit things like oil reserves in the United States, to drill in an unregulated fashion for oil, to exploit lumber, to have pollution regulations eased to some extent to allow industry to operate more profitably. So the shift in a more conservative political direction at the national and state levels in many parts of the United States from the 1980s onwards would also help to hinder or restrict the continued ability of the environmental movement to be successful in terms of bringing about major change regarding environmental protection in the United States. Hopefully that addressed the question.
We had a request for you to go back to the slide on the Oregon bottle bill.
Yeah.
They just wanted to see what the governor's name was, and there it is.
Tom McCall is an interesting character. He was himself an avid outdoors person. He enjoyed things like hiking, camping, fishing, and he had actually been a TV journalist in Portland, Oregon in the early 1960s. And as a TV journalist, he had explored the idea of water pollution and air pollution in Oregon in the early 1960s. And when he entered politics in the 1960s, that would be one of the issues that he was most concerned about. McCall would do things like, for example, this effort to impose a required refund on beverage containers like cans and bottles. So that if you were living in Oregon, you could bring back your soda can or your beer bottle and get a refund on it. And that was designed to encourage recycling of beverage cans and bottles. But that's only one of the things that McCall would do regarding protection of the environment once he became governor in the late 1960s. Incidentally, McCall was a Republican. And so environmental protection was not a Democratic issue solely at this point. It was a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats agreed about the need to protect the environment in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Another prime example of this would be the Washington governor at this point, a man called Daniel Evans, who was also a Republican, and who would introduce a series of laws kind of following the model of Oregon in the late 1960s that again protected the environment to some extent in Washington, although he would fail to get a bottle bill enacted in Washington in the way that McCall had enacted it in Oregon in the early 1970s.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have 2 more questions that I can see.
Okay.
From Theo, do you think that current COVID-19 pandemic may provide an impetus for broader support for measures to combat climate change, given the connection between the emergence of zoonoses and species endangerment and the environmental degradation?
That's a great question. My cop-out answer is that I'm a historian. I don't predict the future, so I really don't know. I do know that, generally speaking, times of crisis tend to spark reform. And this may be the type of crisis, this current pandemic may be the type of crisis that might spark some efforts at environmental reform, not just in the United States, but across the world. I think one thing that's evident as a result of the pandemic is that, of course, there's far fewer cars and trucks on the roads. And it's noticeable that even given the cleaner vehicles that we drive today, that there is far less air pollution around major cities, not just in the United States, but across the world, as a result of the stay-at-home orders that most major nations are following at the moment. That may in turn help to spark some reforms with regard to dealing with climate change. But again, I'm a historian, not able to predict the future. Ask me 30 years from now, when as a historian, I'll be happy to try to analyze what happens in the aftermath of this pandemic.
Sounds good. Okay, the next question's from BJ. BJ says they came in late. Sorry if you already addressed this, but do you have any thoughts on the economic impact of environmental regulation on Oregon's economy or the Pacific Northwest more generally in the 1980s? Their sense is environmental regulation is unfairly blamed for declines in logging, etc.
I think there's going to be a mixed reaction in places like Oregon, or also in Washington, which will also experience limits on logging and things like that in the 1980s and 1990s. There's going to be a mixed reaction to environmental regulation. People who depended on industries like, for example, logging or mining or fishing, commercial fishing, are not going to be happy about regulations on those industries. They would have preferred to continue the business as usual before those regulations. But many other people in those states, particularly people who don't rely on those industries for their livelihood, are going to welcome the improvement in the environment brought about by these changes in laws, particularly with regard to the improved recreational opportunities. So communities that depend on tourism, for example, are going to benefit from some of the changes in the laws regarding environmental protection, while at the same time, communities that might have depended on things like logging are definitely going to be experiencing some economic downturn. Some previously logging dependent communities are going to try to transfer or transition into being more tourism dependent. A prime example of this might, for example, be the town of Forks on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, which was a almost exclusively logging dependent community up until the 1990s. And then as the logging industry went into decline, in part because of increased regulation of logging, that community tried to transition with some success into a tourism-oriented economy. For those of you not familiar with Forks, Forks is where the Twilight series of novels about vampires are located, and Forks tried to exploit that connection for tourism purposes over the course of the last 15 to 20 years. I'm not a fan of the Twilight series, so I really couldn't make any comments about that.
Funny. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, so I will give it another 5 seconds in case there's any last-minute questions coming through. But in the meantime, please take our survey. I would really appreciate if you do that. It helps us to run Earth Week events like this, and the link for that is in the chat box. So please, please, please fill that out if you've enjoyed this presentation today. And I would like to thank you, Brian, one last time for joining us, and as well to all the attendees who joined us online. We really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to everybody who's helped to facilitate this. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to end the session now. Thanks so much. Bye.
All right, thank you, everybody.